The first time Kethvar saw a human, he thought they looked fragile. Commander Sarah Chen stood barely 5.5 feet tall, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation knot. Hands that seemed too small to hold a plasma rifle properly. She had walked into the Joint Command Center on Station Omega-7 with the confident stride of someone who owned the room. But Kethvar's trained eye catalogued her weaknesses. No natural armor plating like his own chitinous shell. No enhanced musculature like the Corvan shock troopers. No telepathic combat coordination like the Altarian battle minds. Just soft pink skin, two eyes that couldn't see into infrared spectrums, and a frame that looked like it would snap under the recoil of a heavy weapon. The Zephyrian commander found himself wondering how such a species had survived long enough to achieve spaceflight, let alone earn a seat at the Galactic Defense Council. "Commander Kethvar," Chen said, extending one of those small hands in the human gesture of greeting. Her grip was firm but not crushing, another mark of weakness in his assessment. "I've read your service record. Impressive work at the Vega defense line." Kethvar's mandibles clicked in acknowledgement. "Your species' reputation precedes you as well, Commander Chen. Though I admit the reports seem somewhat—" He paused, searching for a diplomatic word. "Exaggerated." Chen's lips curved upward, an expression he'd learned indicated human amusement. "I get that a lot. Most species do when they first meet us." She gestured to the massive holographic display showing the Kepler 442 system. "Shall we discuss why the Council sent both our fleets to this particular rock?" The briefing that followed painted a grim picture. The Devourers, as the humans called them, had emerged from the void between galaxies 18 months ago. Unlike previous threats the Galactic Defense Council had faced, these entities didn't want territory or resources. They consumed life itself, stripping planets bare of every organic molecule before moving to the next system. Their technology seemed to bend reality itself, making conventional defensive strategies useless. Kepler 442b hosted a research colony of mixed species, 3 million souls studying the system's unique gravitational anomalies. When the Devourer fleet had appeared at the system's edge 6 days ago, the colony's desperate distress call had reached the Council just as long-range sensors detected the enemy's terrifying capability. Each Devourer ship stretched 50 kilometers in length, their hulls seeming to absorb light itself. Early reconnaissance suggested they could strip a planet's biosphere clean in less than 48 hours. "The evacuation ships won't reach the colony for another 72 hours, Chen explained, highlighting the tactical display with swift, precise gestures. "Our combined fleets need to hold the line until then." Kethvar studied the numbers with growing unease. His Zephyrian battle group consisted of 12 heavy cruisers and 36 fast attack vessels. Each ship a masterwork of engineering with shields that could deflect stellar radiation and weapons that could crack asteroids. Chen's human fleet was smaller but more diverse. 8 ships of varying classes, their designs seeming almost primitive compared to the elegant curves of Zephyrian technology. "Commander," he said carefully, "my tactical analysis suggests we are significantly outgunned. The Devourer fleet masses nearly 3 times our combined tonnage, and their energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases." "That's true," Chen agreed, seemingly unconcerned by the mathematical certainty of their destruction. "But they've never faced humans before." The confidence in her voice puzzled Kethvar. In his experience, successful military commanders balanced optimism with realistic assessment of capabilities. Chen spoke as if she possessed some secret weapon that would balance the scales, but her fleet specifications showed nothing revolutionary. Human ships relied on kinetic weapons and nuclear warheads, technology that seemed laughably primitive compared to the exotic matter disruptors and quantum torpedoes his own vessels carried. Over the next 18 hours, as the 2 fleets took position around Kepler 442b, Kethvar observed the humans with growing confusion. They didn't behave like any military force he'd encountered in his 40-year career. While Zephyrian crews maintained strict hierarchical discipline, human personnel seemed to operate with an informality that bordered on chaos. He watched junior officers openly debate strategy with their commanders, saw enlisted personnel making suggestions that were actually implemented without regard for proper chain of command. Even more disturbing was their apparent disregard for proper defensive positioning. Standard galactic naval doctrine called for formation fighting, with heavier ships providing protective screens for lighter vessels while maintaining optimal firing solutions. The humans scattered their fleet across a much wider area, each ship operating with dangerous independence that should have made coordinated defense impossible. "Commander Chen," he transmitted during one particularly frustrating tactical discussion, "your vessel positioning violates every principle of defensive fleet engagement. You're leaving massive gaps that the enemy can exploit." "I know," came her maddeningly calm reply. "We fight differently than most species." That night, as both fleets maintained their vigil, Kethvar found himself unable to achieve proper rest cycle. His quarters aboard the flagship felt cramped despite being designed to Zephyrian specifications, and his mind kept returning to the tactical impossibilities ahead. Long-range sensors showed the Devourer fleet approaching with inexorable patience, their massive forms creating distortions in space-time itself. He was reviewing fleet specifications for the 100th time when his communication console chimed with an incoming personal message. The source surprised him. Commander Chen, requesting private visual communication. Her image appeared on his screen, and Kethvar noticed she looked different somehow. The professional mask had slipped slightly, revealing something rawer underneath. She was in what appeared to be her personal quarters, sparse by any species standards, but somehow warm in a way Zephyrian spaces never achieved. "Commander Kethvar," she began. "I wanted to talk before tomorrow's engagement." "Off the record." "Speak freely," he replied, curiosity overriding protocol. Chen leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "I know our tactics seem reckless to you. Hell, they seem reckless to most humans too. But I need you to understand something about my species before we go into battle together." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Every other spacefaring race we've encountered developed their civilization through logic, careful planning, natural selection favoring traits like intelligence and cooperation. Humans, we're different. We evolved as persistence hunters on a death world where everything was trying to kill us. We survived by being too stupid to know when we were beaten and too stubborn to stay down when we were." The concept seemed alien to Kethvar. Zephyrian culture valued calculated risk and measured response. The idea of a species succeeding through stubborn refusal to accept defeat was antithetical to everything he understood about survival. "What I'm trying to tell you," Chen continued, "is that when tomorrow comes, you're going to see things that don't make tactical sense. You're going to watch humans make decisions that seem like suicide. And I need you to trust us anyway, because that apparent craziness is exactly what's kept us alive for 200,000 years." Before Kethvar could respond, proximity alarms began screaming throughout both fleets. The Devourers had arrived 6 hours ahead of schedule. Emergency lighting bathed the bridge in harsh red as Kethvar's crew rushed to battle stations. Through the main view screen, he could see them. 12 massive vessels emerging from hyperspace like living nightmares. Their hulls seemed to drink in starlight, creating patches of absolute darkness against the starfield. As they drew closer, Kethvar could make out details that made his exoskeleton crawl. The ships weren't just dark, they pulsed with organic rhythms, as if the vessels themselves were alive. "All units, this is Chen," the human commander's voice cut through the chaos of battle preparation. "Devourers are deploying in standard consumption formation around the planet. Primary objective remains unchanged. Protect the colony until evacuation arrives." "Acknowledged," Kethvar replied, even as his tactical displays painted increasingly dire projections. The Devourer ships were positioning themselves in a perfect sphere around Kepler 442b, each vessel generating some kind of energy field that was already beginning to strip away the planet's upper atmosphere. "My lord," his tactical officer reported, "the enemy energy output is beyond our measurement capabilities. At current consumption rate, the planet's biosphere will be completely destroyed in 43 hours. 72 hours until evacuation. 43 hours until everyone on the planet died." The mathematics were brutally simple. "Chen," he transmitted, "recommend immediate engagement while we retain tactical mobility. If we allow them to complete their consumption formation." "Negative," came her reply. "All human vessels are moving to close engagement range. Kethvar, keep your ships back and provide support fire when opportunities present themselves." He watched in horror as the 8 human vessels accelerated directly toward the Devourer formation. It was textbook suicide, light escorts charging heavy battleships without support or coordination. Every principle of naval warfare screamed against such tactics. The lead human ship, Chen's vessel Indomitable, was the first to enter weapons range. Kethvar expected to see it vaporized by the overwhelming firepower of the nearest Devourer, but something unprecedented happened instead. The Devourer ship, massive beyond comprehension, actually shifted position. It moved away from the approaching human vessel, disrupting its own energy field in the process. For a brief moment, the consumption pattern around the planet flickered and weakened. "All Zephyrian vessels," Kethvar ordered, "target the disrupted Devourer ship. Full spread, quantum torpedoes." His fleet's weapons found their mark just as the Devourer restored its defensive fields, but the damage was done. For the first time in any recorded engagement, a Devourer's ship showed visible battle damage, its hull scorched and bleeding some kind of luminous fluid into space. Holy shit, came Chen's voice over the comm, human profanity that somehow seemed entirely appropriate. Did you see that? They actually backed down. The implications hit Cathvar like a physical blow. The Devourers, who had never shown any response to conventional military threats, had actually retreated from a single human ship, not because of superior firepower or tactical advantage, but because of something else entirely. As the engagement continued through the night, Cathvar began to understand what Chen had tried to tell him. The humans weren't fighting a conventional naval battle. They were doing something that made the Devourers fundamentally uncomfortable, something that disrupted their ability to coordinate their planet-killing formation. Every time a human ship charged directly at a Devourer vessel, the massive enemy ship would shift position slightly, breaking the precise geometric pattern needed for efficient biosphere consumption. The humans weren't trying to destroy the enemy fleet, they were trying to make them flinch. And incredibly, impossibly, it was working. When the first day's engagement finally ended, both sides had withdrawn to assess damage and regroup. The human fleet had lost 2 ships entirely and suffered severe damage to 3 others. Cathvar's forces had remained largely intact thanks to their supporting role, though his ammunition reserves were running dangerously low. But the planet below them was still alive, its atmosphere intact and its population still breathing. The consumption that should have been completed in 43 hours hadn't even properly begun. As Cathvar reviewed battle reports in the quiet of his command center, he found his understanding of warfare fundamentally challenged. According to every tactical manual he'd ever studied, the human attack should have resulted in complete fleet destruction. Instead, they had achieved something that no military force in galactic history had managed. They had made the Devourers hesitate. His communication console chimed with another personal message from Chen. This time, her image showed the strain of the day's fighting. Her uniform was stained with what appeared to be her own blood, and her left arm was immobilized in some kind of medical brace. Not bad for a day's work, she said, that strange human smile returning despite her obvious pain. Your quantum torpedoes pack a hell of a punch when the bastards aren't expecting them. Commander Chen, Cathvar began, then paused. Military protocol seemed inadequate for what he'd witnessed. Your tactics today, they defied every principle of naval engagement I know. Yet somehow, they worked. Like I said, we fight different. Chen winced as she adjusted her injured arm. The thing is, we're not done yet. Tomorrow's going to be harder. The Devourers will adapt to what we did today, and we'll have to find new ways to make them uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. Cathvar repeated the word, testing its implications. You're not trying to defeat them. You're trying to unsettle them? Chen's expression grew thoughtful. Have you ever wondered why the Devourers have been so successful against every other species? It's not just their technology or their size. It's because they operate according to a logic that makes sense to them but terrifies everyone else. They're perfectly efficient, perfectly coordinated, perfectly empty. She leaned closer to her screen. But humans? We've never made sense, not even to ourselves. We're chaotic and contradictory and completely irrational half the time. And that terrifies them because they can't predict us, can't understand us, can't reduce us to a simple equation. As if to emphasize her point, proximity alarms began sounding again. But this time, they weren't detecting approaching enemy vessels. Long-range sensors showed something far more disturbing. The Devourer fleet was repositioning itself, no longer maintaining the precise consumption formation around the planet. Instead, they were forming a battle line. Well, Chen said, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and dread. Looks like we got their attention. Tomorrow, they're going to try to fight us properly. The communication ended, leaving Cathvar alone with the tactical implications of what was coming. The Devourers had never engaged in ship-to-ship combat before, had never needed to. Their standard operating procedure was orbital consumption while ignoring whatever token resistance local forces could muster. But the humans had changed that equation. They had forced an enemy that operated on cosmic scales to acknowledge their existence, to treat them as a genuine threat worth responding to directly. As he prepared for sleep cycle, Cathvar found himself thinking about Chen's words. The humans fought differently, she had said. They didn't make sense. And somehow, that senselessness was their greatest weapon against an enemy that had conquered half the galaxy through pure, efficient logic. Tomorrow would bring the real test. Tomorrow, he would discover what happened when an unstoppable force met an unmovable object that refused to acknowledge it was supposed to be moved. Tomorrow, he would learn whether human stubbornness could stand against the death of worlds itself. Dawn in space was an arbitrary concept, but HFY had learned to think in human terms during their brief alliance. The star, Kepler, double, double, double. 442 cast its pale light across both fleets as they prepared for what tactical analysis suggested would be the final engagement. The evacuation ships were still 48 hours away, while the Devourer battle line had spent the night configuring itself into something unprecedented in galactic military history. 12 vessels, each larger than a Zephyrian city, had arranged themselves in a perfect hexagonal formation around the planet. But unlike their previous consumption pattern, this arrangement was clearly designed for combat. Energy signatures indicated they were powering weapon systems that had never been used before, weapons that had remained dormant during their systematic destruction of 17 different civilizations. "Commander," his tactical officer reported, "the enemy formation generates overlapping fields of fire that cover all possible approach vectors. Any vessel entering their engagement zone will face concentrated fire from at least 6 Devourer ships simultaneously." HFY studied the display with growing unease. His own fleet's quantum torpedoes had proven effective when the enemy was distracted, but a direct assault against that formation would be pure suicide. Even if every Zephyrian ship fired simultaneously, they lacked the firepower to penetrate the combined defensive screens of 12 Devourer vessels. "Sir," his communications officer added, "Commander Chen is requesting immediate conference with all senior staff." The joint briefing that followed challenged every assumption HFY had made about human military doctrine. Chen appeared on screen looking remarkably composed for someone whose fleet had been reduced to 6 operational vessels, 4 of which showed severe battle damage. Behind her, HFY could see human crew members working with fevered intensity, but their activity seemed less like repair work and more like extensive modification. "Gentlemen," Chen began, addressing both her own staff and the Zephyrian commanders, "overnight analysis has confirmed our initial assessment. The Devourers have abandoned their consumption protocol to focus entirely on destroying our fleets. This represents an unprecedented tactical shift." Admiral Sektoth, HFY's second-in-command, clicked his mandibles skeptically. "Commander Chen, while this change may seem advantageous, it merely alters the timeline of our defeat. We lack the firepower to engage their battle formation directly."
"That's true."
Chen agreed with disturbing cheerfulness. A conventional assault would result in complete fleet destruction within approximately 14 minutes, so we're not going to fight conventionally. She gestured to someone off-screen, and the tactical display shifted to show a 3-dimensional model of human fleet modifications. HFY stared in amazement as he realized what the humans had done during the night. They had stripped defensive systems from their damaged vessels, rerouting power to engines and life support. Rather than repairing their fleet, they had intentionally made their ships more vulnerable. "Every human vessel is now carrying maximum engine output with minimal shielding," Chen explained. "We've also removed most of our weapon systems to make room for something else." The display zoomed in to show cargo bays that had been hastily converted into passenger compartments. Crude but functional life support systems had been jury-rigged throughout the human ships, creating space for far more personnel than their original designs intended. "You're converting your warships into evacuation vessels," HFY realized. "Partly," Chen said. "But that's not the interesting part. Show them the real modifications, Jenkins." A young human technician took over the display, highlighting changes that made HFY's exoskeleton crawl. The humans had installed some kind of proximity triggers throughout their ships, connected to what appeared to be their entire complement of nuclear warheads. Every human vessel had essentially been converted into a massive bomb. "With respect, Commander," Admiral Sektoth interjected, "suicide attacks may be honored in human culture, but they will not significantly damage Devourer vessels. Their shields can absorb nuclear detonations." Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "You're right that our nukes won't hurt them much, but that's not why we're going to ram their ships." The casual way she mentioned ramming city-sized vessels with her tiny escorts sent chills through every Zephyrian officer. HFY had studied human history during their alliance, learning about their species' tendency towards self-destructive heroics, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. "Commander Chen," he said carefully, "surely there must be alternative strategies that don't require the complete destruction of your fleet." "Actually, no." She pulled up tactical projections that painted the situation in stark mathematical terms. "Computer modeling shows we have exactly one advantage. The Devourers have never faced an enemy willing to accept total losses to achieve objectives. They're configured to fight rational opponents who value ship preservation. The implications of her words struck home. Every spacefaring civilization prioritized ship survival because vessels represented enormous investments in resources and trained personnel. Fleets that suffered more than 30% losses typically withdrew to avoid complete destruction. But the humans were planning to accept 100% casualties as their opening move. The thing is, Chen continued, we're not just going to ram them and explode. We're going to do something much worse from their perspective. She nodded to Jenkins, who began displaying the most disturbing part of the human plan. Each ship's modified cargo bays weren't just designed to carry evacuees. They were designed to carry evacuees directly into Devourer vessels. The nuclear warheads weren't intended to destroy enemy ships. They were intended to breach their hulls and create entry points. You're planning to board them, Kethvar said, his voice barely containing his horror. 12 ships? Approximately 4,000 human personnel per vessel, Chen confirmed. We're going to put nearly 50,000 humans aboard Devourer ships and see what happens when they try to digest us. The briefing continued for another hour, but Kethvar found himself struggling to process the sheer audacity of the human plan. They weren't just accepting defeat, they were transforming defeat into something else entirely. By converting their warships into boarding craft, they were attempting to take the battle into an environment where Devourer advantages might not apply. More disturbing still was the casual way human personnel discussed their approaching deaths. During a brief recess, Kethvar listened to conversations between human officers and found them discussing technical details of ship modifications, optimal boarding procedures, and equipment distribution. None of them seemed to be dwelling on the fact that their plan had a projected survival rate of 0%. Commander Kethvar, Chen approached him during the break. I have a request that's outside normal Alliance protocols. Speak freely. My people are about to do something that violates every principle of civilized warfare. We're going to board enemy vessels with the sole purpose of causing maximum disruption before we're killed. She paused, meeting his compound eyes directly. I need you to document what happens. Someone needs to record what humans are willing to do when everything else fails. The weight of her request settled on him like a physical burden. She was asking him to witness humanity's final gambit, to serve as historian for what might be their species' last significant act in galactic affairs. Why me? He asked. Chen smiled, but it was different from her previous expressions. This smile carried weight, the kind that came from decisions that couldn't be unmade. Because you understand military honor, but you're not human enough to think our plan makes sense, you'll record what actually happens, not what we hope will happen. 3 hours later, both fleets moved into engagement positions. The Devourer formation maintained its perfect hexagonal arrangement, weapons charging to levels that made space itself shimmer with barely contained energy. Long-range sensors showed their hulls beginning to pulse with that organic rhythm again, as if the vessels were preparing to feed. Kethvar positioned his fleet at maximum weapons range, prepared to provide covering fire for what human military doctrine would have classified as an elaborate suicide mission. His ship's quantum torpedoes were fully loaded, and his crew stood ready to exploit whatever chaos the human assault might create. All vessels, Chen's voice carried across both fleets, calm and professional despite what lay ahead. Final systems check complete. Remember, our job is to buy time for the colonists and make the Devourers remember why they should fear organic life. The human ships began their final approach, accelerating to ramming speed with their makeshift modifications glowing from engine strain. At this distance, Kethvar could see the crude welding work that had converted elegant warships into something between boarding craft and projectiles. Human engineering at its most desperate and resourceful. Sir, his tactical officer reported, Devourer formation is opening fire. The first wave of enemy weapons struck the approaching human vessels with energy discharges that lit up space like miniature stars. Kethvar watched 2 human ships simply vanish, their matter converted to expanding clouds of superheated plasma, but the remaining 4 continued their charge, now moving too fast for evasive maneuvers. Covering fire, Kethvar ordered. All ships target the Devourer vessels engaging human forces. His fleet's quantum torpedoes struck Devourer shields just as the surviving human ships reached their targets. The timing was perfect. Enemy defensive screens flickered just long enough for the human vessels to penetrate them at ramming speed. What followed defied everything Kethvar understood about space combat. Instead of the massive explosions he expected, the human ships seemed to dissolve into their targets, their nuclear warheads detonating in precisely controlled sequences that created breaches rather than destruction. Through his ship's enhanced sensors, he could detect the impossible, 40,000 human life signs now registered inside Devourer vessels. My lord, his communications officer said, voice filled with wonder, we're receiving transmissions from inside the enemy ships. Put them through. The comm channel filled with sounds of combat unlike anything in Kethvar's experience. Human voices shouting tactical information, the distinctive whine of their projectile weapons, and underneath it all, a sound that chilled him to his exoskeleton. Devourer ships were screaming. Not metaphorically screaming. The massive vessels were generating audio frequencies that registered as sounds of distress, transmitted through their hulls into space itself. In 40 years of military service, Kethvar had never heard an enemy ship make sounds of pain. Jenkins to any receiving station, came a human voice over the comm, barely audible through static and background noise. We're inside the primary vessel. This place is... God, it's alive. The whole ship is alive, and it's not happy about having visitors. Boarding Party 7 to Fleet Command, another voice reported. We've reached what looks like a control center. Everything here is organic, like being inside a giant animal. We're setting charges on anything that looks important. The tactical display showed chaos spreading through the Devourer formation. Ships that had maintained perfect positioning for hours were beginning to drift out of formation, their precise battle lines degrading as internal systems failed or were sabotaged. But more significantly, the energy signatures that had marked Devourer weapons were fluctuating wildly. Whatever the humans were doing inside those ships was disrupting the aliens' ability to coordinate their devastating firepower. Sir, his tactical officer reported with barely contained excitement, enemy weapons efficiency has dropped by 60%. They're having trouble maintaining target locks. Kethvar seized the opportunity immediately. All ships, maximum rate of fire. Target any Devourer vessel showing systems instability. The next 20 minutes redefined space warfare in Kethvar's mind. His fleet's weapons, previously ineffective against Devourer defenses, now found their marks with devastating consistency. Enemy shields flickered and failed as their operators struggled to deal with internal sabotage while managing external threats. Through it all, human voices continued reporting over the comm channels. Their transmissions painted a picture of warfare beyond anything in Galactic Council military doctrine. The humans weren't just fighting inside alien ships. They were adapting to an environment designed by completely foreign intelligence. Martinez here. Came one transmission. We found their version of an engine room. It's like a giant heart actually pumping some kind of fluid through the whole ship. Setting charges now. Thompson's team to anyone listening, another voice reported. We've been fighting these questions, things that look like antibodies. They're trying to digest us, but our environment suits are holding up. Moving toward what might be their bridge. The reports continued, each one more surreal than the last. Humans were navigating living starships, fighting biological defenses, and systematically destroying systems that had been grown rather than built. They were waging war inside entities that were as much organisms as vessels. Then, 37 minutes after the initial boarding, something unprecedented happened. One of the Devourer ships stopped functioning entirely. Not destroyed, not damaged, but simply dead. Its energy signatures flatlined. Its organic pulsing ceased, and it began drifting like a massive corpse through space. For the first time in galactic history, a Devourer vessel had been killed rather than merely damaged. Holy shit, came Chen's voice over the comm. Transmitted from inside the dead ship. We actually killed it. The whole thing just died. Like an animal when you destroy its brain. The effect on the remaining Devourer formation was immediate and catastrophic. The perfectly coordinated battle line collapsed as surviving ships began moving erratically, their behavior patterns shifting from calculated military precision to something that looked disturbingly like panic. All Zephyrian vessels, Kethvar ordered, concentrate fire on the most damaged enemy ships. Maximum aggression. What followed was less a space battle than a slaughter. Devourer ships that had seemed invincible hours earlier now succumbed to conventional weapons fire, their defenses compromised by internal sabotage and their coordination shattered by the loss of their fallen companion. Within an hour, 8 of the 12 Devourer vessels had been destroyed or disabled. The remaining 4 broke formation entirely, retreating toward the system's edge with clear signs of battle damage and systems failures. As the enemy withdrawal became clear, Kethvar found himself staring at tactical displays that should have been impossible. His combined fleet, which had begun the day facing certain annihilation, had achieved total victory against an enemy that had never been defeated before. But the cost was exactly what Chen had predicted. 40,000 humans had died in the boarding actions, their life signs winking out one by one, as Devourer internal defenses overcame their crude protective equipment. Of the humans who had volunteered for the assault, perhaps a few hundred were recovered alive from the dead enemy vessels. The surviving human ships, their crews reduced to skeleton complements, limped back toward the planet they had saved. Commander Chen's vessel was among them. Those sensor readings indicated massive hull breaches and failing life support systems. Commander Chen, HFY transmitted. My medical facilities are at your disposal. We can transfer your wounded personnel to properly equipped treatment centers. Appreciate the offer, came her tired reply. But we need to stay with our ships until the evacuation fleet arrives. Can't risk the colonists if any devourers come back. In the aftermath of the battle, as both fleets began damage assessment and casualty reports, HFY found himself struggling with questions that challenged his understanding of military service itself. The humans had achieved victory through complete disregard for their own survival, transforming certain defeat into triumph through sheer willingness to die. But more than that, they had shown that devourers could be beaten. The entities that had consumed 17 civilizations weren't invincible gods of destruction. They were simply another form of life, one that could be killed if someone was willing to pay the price. That night, as he compiled his preliminary battle report, HFY realized that everything about galactic warfare had changed. The devourers would adapt to what had happened at Kepler. 442b would develop countermeasures against boarding actions and biological warfare, but they had revealed a fundamental weakness. They could be surprised, confused, and ultimately defeated by opponents who fought outside conventional military logic. The humans had taught the galaxy that sometimes the only way to win was to accept that victory might cost everything, including the lives of those achieving it. They had redefined courage from calculated risk-taking to absolute commitment regardless of personal survival. As he settled into rest cycle, HFY found himself thinking about Chen's final transmission from inside the dead Devourer ship. We actually killed it. The wonder in her voice, the amazement that their desperate gambit had worked, stayed with him. Tomorrow would bring the evacuation fleet and the beginning of real recovery efforts. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of the most brutal space battle in galactic history, HFY began to understand what Chen had meant about humans fighting differently. They didn't fight to win. They fought to make their deaths meaningful. And somehow, that made them more dangerous than any weapon in the galaxy. The evacuation fleet arrived to find Kepler. 442b. Still alive. Its 3 million inhabitants breathing air that should have been stripped away days ago. Admiral Korvex of the Galactic Emergency Response Division had expected to find empty space and the molecular remains of another failed defensive action. Instead, his sensors detected the impossible. A functioning colony, orbital debris from defeated Devourer ships, and 2 battered fleets maintaining defensive positions. HFY watched the massive evacuation ships take position around the planet with mixed feelings. Relief at the colonists' survival warred with a growing unease about what the victory had cost, not just in human lives but in his understanding of warfare itself. The battle reports he'd compiled over the past 18 hours read like fiction, full of tactical impossibilities that had somehow become reality. Commander, his communications officer reported, Admiral Korvex is requesting immediate briefing with all senior commanders. The conference that followed would later be called the Kepler Testimony, though at the time it seemed like a standard post-action debriefing. Representatives from 12 different species listened as HFY and the surviving human officers described what had transpired during the Devourer engagement. Admiral Korvex, a veteran Altairian whose species specialized in telepathic military coordination, seemed particularly disturbed by the tactical reports. His large, multifaceted eyes remained fixed on the data displays as if trying to find some error in the mathematics of human sacrifice. Commander Chen, Korvex said, his mental voice carrying undertones of disbelief that translated poorly through universal communicators. Your report indicates that human personnel voluntarily accepted 100% casualty projections. This level of military sacrifice exceeds even theoretical maximum commitment parameters. Chen, her left arm now in a proper medical brace and her face bearing the exhaustion of 3 days without proper rest, met the Admiral's gaze steadily. That's correct, sir. Every human who participated in the boarding actions knew they wouldn't be coming back. But why? The question came from Colonel Thexme, a Corvan shock trooper whose species prided itself on military aggression. What tactical doctrine supports complete unit sacrifice for uncertain strategic gains? None, Chen replied simply. There wasn't any doctrine for what we did. We made it up as we went along. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably, as career military officers from across the galaxy tried to process the implications.
Kethvar had experienced the same cognitive disconnect during the battle itself, watching humans implement tactics that violated every principle of military science while somehow achieving unprecedented success. "Commander Kethvar," Admiral Korvax said, turning his attention to the Zephyrian, "your preliminary report suggests that human boarding actions created systemic failures in Devourer vessels."
Can you elaborate on the technical aspects of their success? Kethvar activated the holographic display, showing sensor readings from inside the defeated Devourer ships. The data was unlike anything in Galactic Defense Council archives, partly because no one had ever successfully penetrated a Devourer vessel before the human assault. The enemy ships appear to be biological entities rather than mechanical constructs, he explained. Human personnel reported navigating what they described as living tissue, encountering defensive systems that function more like immune responses than automated security. He highlighted specific sensor readings that still made his exoskeleton crawl. Interior temperatures averaged 37 degrees Celsius, optimal for human physiology but potentially problematic for most galactic species. Atmospheric composition was nitrogen-oxygen with trace organic compounds, again suspiciously compatible with human biology. Suspiciously? Admiral Korvax inquired. The environmental conditions inside Devourer ships were more suitable for humans than for any other known species, Kethvar explained. Almost as if the entities were designed to process carbon-based life forms similar to Earth fauna. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If Devourer ships were optimized for consuming human-type biology, it suggested they had encountered similar species before. But the galactic databases contained no records of the Devourers prior to 18 months ago, when they had emerged from the void between galaxies. Chen cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the immediate tactical situation. With respect, Admiral, we need to address the bigger picture here. We killed 4 Devourer ships and sent the rest running, but they're going to adapt. Whatever advantage surprise gave us won't work twice. Explain. The Devourers that escaped have tactical data on human boarding procedures, biological samples from our casualties, and detailed information about our equipment and methods. Chen pulled up strategic projections that painted a grim picture. Next time they encounter human forces, they'll be prepared for internal assault tactics. Admiral Korvax studied the data with growing unease. Recommendations? We need to study the ships we killed, Chen said immediately. Find out what they actually are, how they work, why they react so badly to having humans crawling around inside them. The boarding actions gave us samples and sensor data that might explain how to fight them more efficiently. Agreed, Korvax replied. I'm authorizing full xenobiology teams to examine the defeated vessels. Commander Kethvar, your fleet will provide security for research operations while evacuation procedures are completed. Over the next 72 hours, as civilian transports ferried 3 million colonists to safety, the first detailed examination of Devourer technology began. What the research teams discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life itself. Dr. Chow. Elena Rodriguez, the lead human xenobiologist, briefed senior commanders on findings that seemed to emerge from nightmare rather than scientific analysis. Her presentation took place aboard Admiral Korvax's flagship, with Kethvar and Chen participating via secure communication links. Gentlemen, Rodriguez began, these aren't ships in any conventional sense. They're organisms. Specifically, they appear to be highly modified versions of a species we've designated macroparasites, organisms designed to consume entire biospheres before reproducing. She displayed microscopic imagery that made several alien officers leave the briefing early. The samples showed cellular structures that seemed to shift and flow even under laboratory conditions, as if the dead tissue was still attempting to fulfill some terrible biological imperative. The most disturbing aspect, Rodriguez continued, is the degree of modification these organisms have undergone. Natural evolution doesn't produce this level of specialization. Someone or something has been artificially engineering these creatures for billions of years. Admiral Korvax leaned forward, his telepathic emanations carrying waves of concern that affected sensitive species throughout the briefing room. Are you suggesting the Devourers are weapons? Not weapons, Rodriguez corrected. Tools. Specifically, they appear to be biological harvesting equipment designed to strip organic material from target worlds and convert it into a form suitable for transport and processing. She highlighted cellular structures that resembled nothing in any galactic biology database. The conversion process is remarkably efficient. They can break down any carbon-based life form into component molecules, then restructure those molecules into what appears to be a standardized food product. Kethvar found his mandibles clicking involuntarily as the implications became clear. You're saying they're farming us. That's exactly what I'm saying.
The Devourers aren't conquerors or destroyers. They're harvesters, processing biological material for consumption by whatever species created them. The silence that followed was broken by Chen's voice over the communication link.
Doctor?
Rodriguez, your report mentions that Devourer internal environment was optimized for human physiology. Any theories about why? Rodriguez pulled up comparative biological data that painted an even more disturbing picture. The atmospheric composition, temperature ranges, and gravitational fields inside Devourer ships aren't just suitable for humans. They're ideal for a broader category of species that share certain evolutionary characteristics with Earth life. She displayed a chart showing biological compatibility ratings across different galactic species. Humans, along with approximately 40% of known intelligent species, fall into what we're calling type Anopheles, 7 carbon-based life forms. The Devourers appear to be specifically designed to harvest and process type 7 biology. Which means, Chen said slowly, whatever created these things has been studying species like us for a very long time. The briefing continued for another 2 hours, but Kefvar found himself increasingly disturbed by the scientific revelations. The Devourers weren't random destroyers emerging from the cosmic void. They were purpose-built harvesting tools created by an intelligence that viewed organic life as nothing more than raw material. More troubling still was the realization that human boarding tactics had been so effective precisely because the Devourers were designed to contain and process human-type biology. The creatures weren't prepared for their intended prey to fight back from the inside, to turn their own biological systems against them. 3 days after the research briefing, as the last civilian transports departed Kepler 442b, Kefvar found himself alone with Commander Chen in the observation deck of his flagship. Through the massive viewport, they could see the 4 dead Devourer ships drifting like abandoned cathedrals against the starfield. "Penny for your thoughts," Chen said, using a human idiom Kefvar had learned during their brief alliance. "I'm considering the implications of Dr. Rodriguez's findings," he replied. "If the Devourers are harvesting tools created by some unknown intelligence, then our victory here may have attracted unwanted attention." Chen nodded grimly. "Whoever built these things is going to notice that 4 of their harvesters went missing. They'll want to know what happened. My concern extends beyond immediate tactical threats," Kefvar continued. "Your species demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally altered the balance of this conflict. The Galactic Defense Council will want to understand how humans achieved what no other military force has managed." "And that worries you?" Kefvar turned from the viewport to face his human counterpart directly. "Commander Chen, in my 40 years of military service, I have observed that species capable of unprecedented violence often find themselves invited to apply that violence on behalf of others. The Council will want to weaponize what humanity accomplished here." Chen was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "You think they'll ask us to throw away more lives fighting Devourers? I think they will ask our species to sacrifice itself repeatedly until either the Devourer threat is eliminated or humanity is extinct," Kefvar said bluntly. "The mathematics are brutally simple. Human boarding tactics can defeat Devourer ships, but at the cost of complete crew casualties. From a strategic perspective, trading human lives for Devourer vessels is an acceptable exchange rate." The conversation was interrupted by proximity alarms sounding throughout both fleets. Kefvar's tactical officer appeared on the internal comm system, his voice carrying urgent professionalism tinged with fear. "Commander, long-range sensors are detecting massive hyperspace disturbances at the edge of the system. Multiple contacts bearing consistent with Devourer fleet signatures." Kefvar and Chen rushed to the command center, where tactical displays painted a picture that sent chills through every crew member. 47 Devourer vessels were emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation, each ship larger than the ones they had fought 3 days earlier. "Jesus Christ," Chen whispered. "They sent a whole fucking fleet." Admiral Korvex's voice cut through the chaos of battle stations preparation. "All vessels, this is Fleet Command. Immediate withdrawal to hyperspace jump coordinates. Evacuation is complete. Primary mission accomplished." "Belay that order," Chen said, her voice carrying across both the tactical network and the general comm channels. "Human ships are remaining in system." "Commander Chen," Korvex replied, "you have 6 operational vessels against 47 enemy contacts. Withdrawal is the only rational tactical option." "Rational doesn't enter into it," Chen said, and Kefvar heard something in her voice that he was beginning to recognize. The same tone she'd used when planning the boarding actions, when accepting complete casualties as an acceptable cost. "Those ships came here because we killed their companions. They're here because of what humans did. That makes this our fight."
Kethvar found himself facing a decision that would define the rest of his military career. Standard Galactic Defense Council doctrine called for immediate withdrawal when facing overwhelming enemy superiority. His ships had fulfilled their mission parameters by protecting the evacuation operation, but he thought about the 40,000 humans who had died boarding Devourer vessels, who had transformed certain defeat into unprecedented victory through sheer willingness to sacrifice everything. He thought about Chen's words about fighting differently, about making deaths meaningful rather than merely tactical. Admiral Korvax, he said, overriding standard communication protocols. The Zephyrian fleet is also remaining in system. If the humans are determined to face this threat, they will not do so alone. What followed was the shortest, most intense tactical discussion in galactic military history. 47 Devourer ships against 6 human vessels and 12 Zephyrian cruisers. The mathematics was so overwhelming that conventional tactical analysis became meaningless. But as Kethvar watched the approaching enemy fleet, he realized that mathematics had become irrelevant the moment humans decided to fight wars by ramming city-sized vessels with modified escorts. The Devourers were expecting rational opponents following logical tactical doctrine. Instead, they were about to face 18 ships crewed by personnel who had learned that victory sometimes required abandoning every principle except absolute commitment to destroying the enemy. All ships, Chen broadcast, this is going to be different from the last engagement. They know our boarding tactics now, so we'll have to find new ways to make them uncomfortable. As the Devourer fleet approached, Kethvar found himself wondering what making them uncomfortable would look like when applied to 47 hostile vessels, but he was beginning to suspect that the answer would redefine warfare itself once again. The humans had taught him that fear wasn't about dying, it was about discovering that everything you thought you understood about conflict was wrong. And as he prepared for what would likely be his final battle, Kethvar realized he was about to learn exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. The 47 Devourer ships approaching Kepler 442b moved with a coordination that suggested shared intelligence rather than fleet communication. Unlike their predecessors, these vessels showed no hesitation, no uncertainty about their purpose. They had come to understand why 4 of their kind had died, and they intended to ensure such losses never occurred again. Kethvar studied the tactical display with the detached fascination of someone witnessing his own execution. The new Devourer fleet was configured differently from the previous engagement, their hulls bristling with previously unseen weapon systems and what appeared to be external defensive screens. They had adapted to the human boarding tactics with terrifying efficiency. Commander, his tactical officer reported, enemy vessels are generating interference fields that will prevent successful ramming attacks. Any approaching ship will be repelled or destroyed long before achieving hull contact. Chen's voice crackled over the comm from her battered flagship. Well, that's inconvenient. Looks like they learned from our last visit. The understatement was so typically human that Kethvar found himself clicking his mandibles in what might have been amusement if the situation hadn't been so completely hopeless. 18 ships against 47, with their only successful tactic now countered by enemy adaptation. Commander Chen, Admiral Korvax transmitted from his withdrawing fleet. Final offer of evacuation assistance. My ships can cover your withdrawal for approximately 12 minutes before the enemy reaches optimal engagement range. Negative, came Chen's immediate reply. We're staying. But Admiral, I need you to do something for us. Specify. When we lose this fight, make sure the Council knows what happened here. Don't let them think humans are some kind of miracle weapon that can solve the Devourer problem without consequences. We're about to show you what happens when we run out of tricks. The communication ended, leaving Kethvar alone with the tactical reality of their situation. No boarding attacks, no surprise advantage, no tactical flexibility that could overcome a nearly 3-to-1 disadvantage against opponents who had superior technology and perfect coordination. Sir, his communications officer said quietly, personal message from Commander Chen. Chen's face appeared on his private screen, and Kethvar was struck by how calm she looked despite their approaching annihilation. Her injuries from the previous battle had been treated, but exhaustion showed in every line of her features. Kethvar, she said, using his personal name for the first time. I wanted to thank you for staying. I know this goes against every principle of Zephyrian military doctrine, as does your entire approach to warfare, he replied. Yet here we are. Chen smiled, but it was different from her previous expressions. This smile carried weight, the kind that came from decisions that transcended military calculations. I have one more favor to ask. Something that's going to sound completely insane. Given our current situation, insanity seems appropriate. I need you to target human ships. The words hit Kethvar like a physical blow. Explain. The Devourers adapted to prevent boarding attacks, but they're still expecting us to try conventional ramming. What they're not expecting is for our own allies to destroy our ships at precisely the right moment to create maximum tactical chaos. Chen pulled up a tactical display that showed human fleet positions relative to the approaching enemy formation. If your ships can destroy our vessels just as we reach the Devourer defensive perimeter, the explosions will disrupt their interference fields long enough for debris and personnel to reach their hulls. Kethvar stared at the proposed plan with horror. You're asking me to murder your crews. I'm asking you to help us make our deaths count for something, Chen corrected. Those people volunteered knowing they wouldn't survive. But now we can use their sacrifice to create opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise. The tactical implications were staggering. By destroying human ships at optimal moments, Kethvar's fleet could create debris fields and energy discharges that would temporarily disable Devourer defensive systems. It would give scattered human survivors brief opportunities to reach enemy hulls before being killed. Commander, he said slowly, this level of tactical sacrifice exceeds anything in galactic military history. You're asking me to participate in the systematic destruction of your own fleet. That's right. And in return, we'll give you something no military force has ever had. 47 opportunities to study Devourer ships from the inside while they're still operational. Before Kethvar could respond, proximity alarms indicated the enemy had reached optimal engagement range. The Devourer fleet opened fire with weapons that turned space itself into a hellscape of exotic energy discharges and twisted space-time. All human ships, Chen broadcast, commence final approach. Remember, we're not trying to win this one. We're trying to learn something that might help the next poor bastards who have to fight these things. What followed was warfare, as performance art, a carefully choreographed dance of destruction that redefined the concept of tactical sacrifice. The 6 remaining human vessels accelerated toward the Devourer formation while Kethvar's ships maneuvered into firing positions that violated every principle of alliance cooperation. The first human ship, Chen's own vessel Indomitable, reached the enemy defensive perimeter 30 seconds ahead of schedule. Kethvar watched through targeting sensors as the ship's crude modifications glowed with engine strain, its hull already showing stress fractures from the acceleration. Kethvar! Chen's voice came over the comm. Fire on my ship in 10 seconds!
Target the engine section for maximum debris dispersion. Commander. That's an order, you alien son of a bitch. Don't make my people's deaths meaningless.
Kethvar gave the firing command with mandibles that clicked involuntarily. His ship's quantum torpedoes struck Indomitable precisely as it reached the Devourer defensive screen, the explosion creating a debris field that disrupted enemy systems for exactly the duration Chen had calculated. Through the chaos of energy discharges and expanding wreckage, Kethvar's sensors detected the impossible. Nearly 800 human life signs had somehow reached the nearest Devourer vessel. Chen's final gambit had worked, turning certain destruction into one last boarding opportunity. The pattern repeated across the engagement zone as Kethvar's fleet systematically destroyed their human allies at precisely calculated moments. Each explosion created brief windows of opportunity that human personnel exploited with desperate efficiency. My lord, his tactical officer reported with barely controlled emotion, we're receiving transmissions from inside multiple enemy vessels. Human boarding parties have successfully penetrated 11 Devourer ships. The communications that followed painted a picture of warfare beyond conventional military experience. Human voices reported navigating alien environments that seemed actively hostile to their presence, fighting biological defenses that adapted in real time to their tactics. Rodriguez here, came one transmission from inside a Devourer ship. These things learned from the last engagement. They're generating some kind of acid mist that's eating through our environment suits. We've got maybe 10 minutes before atmospheric breach kills us all. Jackson's team to Fleet Command. Another voice reported, found what looks like a central nervous system. It's huge, bigger than a city block, and it's definitely aware of us. Setting charges now, but this thing is fighting back with some kind of psychic attack. Half my people are unconscious. The tactical display showed Devourer formation discipline beginning to deteriorate as human sabotage took effect. Ships that had maintained perfect coordination suddenly began showing systems failures and erratic movement patterns. But the cost was exactly what Chen had predicted. Human life signs inside enemy vessels winked out one by one
as alien defenses overcame crude protective equipment.
Unlike the previous engagement, the Devourers had prepared countermeasures specifically designed to kill human boarders. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're losing contact with boarding parties. Enemy countermeasures are proving highly effective." Through it all, human voices continued reporting over increasingly degraded communication channels. Their transmissions revealed technical information about Devourer ship design, defensive systems, and internal structures that no military intelligence service had ever obtained. Chen to any receiving station came a transmission that made Kethvar's exoskeleton crawl. "I'm inside what looks like the primary vessel's brain. This thing is huge, and it's definitely sapient. It's been trying to communicate with me for the past 5 minutes. Commander Chen," Kethvar transmitted immediately. "Clarify your status." "Complicated," came her reply through static that suggested failing equipment. "This ship isn't just alive, it's intelligent, and it's trying to tell me something about whoever built it. Problem is, the acid atmosphere is dissolving my suit faster than I can decode the message." The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as Devourer adaptive defenses eliminated human boarding parties with increasing efficiency. But the sabotage they had accomplished before dying was creating unprecedented opportunities for conventional weapons fire. "All Zephyrian vessels," Kethvar ordered, "concentrate fire on enemy ships showing systems instability. Maximum rate of fire." His fleet's quantum torpedoes found their marks with devastating effectiveness, striking Devourer vessels whose defenses had been compromised by internal sabotage. For the second time in galactic history, Devourer ships began dying under conventional weapons fire. But even as victory became possible, Kethvar found himself haunted by the cost. 6 human ships and nearly 12,000 personnel had been sacrificed to create tactical opportunities that conventional military doctrine would have achieved through superior firepower and coordination. Final transmission from Commander Chen, his communications officer reported. "Signal is heavily degraded." Chen's voice came through the comm system as barely recognizable whispers through electronic noise. "Kethvar found something important. Devourers aren't the real threat. They're running from something else. Something that's been hunting them across the galaxy." The transmission cut off abruptly as sensors registered the death of the primary Devourer vessel. Chen's final sabotage had succeeded, but at the cost of her own life and those of her remaining crew. The battle continued for another 40 minutes, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Human sacrifice had created opportunities that conventional tactics could exploit, resulting in the destruction of 31 Devourer vessels. The survivors fled toward hyperspace, their perfect formation shattered and their technological superiority negated by tactics that no rational military doctrine would have conceived. In the aftermath, as Kethvar compiled casualty reports and battle assessments, he found himself struggling with questions that transcended military analysis. The humans had achieved another impossible victory, but this time there were no survivors to celebrate their success. 12,000 human personnel had died to save a galaxy that barely understood what they had sacrificed. Their names would be recorded in military databases, their tactical innovations studied by strategists across known space, but they would never know the extent of their achievement. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "Admiral Corvex is requesting immediate briefing on engagement results." The briefing that followed would reshape Galactic Defense Council military doctrine and establish humanity as the most feared species in known space. But as Kethvar transmitted his preliminary report, he found himself thinking about Chen's final words. The Devourers weren't the real threat. They were running from something else. Something that had been hunting them across the galaxy. And now, thanks to human sacrifice, the galaxy had attracted the attention of whatever that something was. As he settled into rest cycle, Kethvar realized that the Battle of Kepler 442b hadn't ended the Devourer threat. It had simply announced to the universe that organic life was capable of fighting back, capable of turning predators into prey, through sheer willingness to die for something greater than individual survival. Tomorrow would bring questions about what the humans had discovered inside Devourer ships, about the intelligence that had created living starships designed to harvest entire biospheres. But tonight, Kethvar found himself wondering whether humanity's greatest victory might also prove to be the galaxy's greatest mistake. The humans had taught the universe that some battles were worth dying for. The question was whether they had also taught it that some enemies were too dangerous to defeat. 6 months after the Second Battle of Kepler, 442b, Kethvar stood in the Hall of Fallen Heroes on the Galactic Council homeworld, staring at a memorial wall that contained 18,000 human names. Each name represented someone who had died boarding Devourer vessels, transforming certain defeat into unprecedented victory through tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The memorial had been controversial. Several council member species argued that glorifying such extreme tactical sacrifice would encourage similar recklessness among their own military forces. Others contended that humanity's approach to warfare was too dangerous to commemorate, too alien to understand, too costly to replicate. But Kethvar had insisted on the memorial's construction, using his newfound influence as the galaxy's leading expert on human military doctrine. Because in the months following the battle, as xenobiologists decoded the intelligence gathered from inside Devourer ships, it became clear that human sacrifice had revealed something far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Commander Kethvar, Dr. Elena Rodriguez approached from behind, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent months analyzing nightmares. The council is ready for your final briefing. The conference chamber contained representatives from 47 different species, the largest gathering in council history. They had come to hear the conclusions of the Kepler Investigation Committee to understand what humanity's tactical sacrifices had actually achieved beyond the destruction of Devourer fleets. Kethvar activated the holographic display, showing data that had taken 6 months to compile and analyze. The information painted a picture that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of galactic civilization itself. Honored delegates, he began. The intelligence gathered by human boarding parties during the Kepler engagements has confirmed our worst fears about the Devourer threat. But it has also revealed something far more disturbing. The display shifted to show astronomical data collected from inside Devourer ships, star maps spanning millions of light years and covering regions of space that no galactic civilization had ever explored. The maps showed the paths of Devourer fleets across vast distances, tracking their movement through thousands of different systems over what appeared to be billions of years. The Devourers are not invaders, Kethvar continued.
They are refugees. The silence that followed was broken by Admiral Corvex's mental emanations carrying waves of disbelief that affected telepathic species throughout the chamber.
Explain. Analysis of Devourer biological samples indicates they are artificial constructs created by an unknown intelligence as biological tools for harvesting organic material from planetary biospheres.
But the star maps recovered from their ships show they have been fleeing across the galaxy for over 3 billion years, consuming worlds not for conquest but for survival.
Dr.
Rodriguez took over the briefing, her presentation displaying microscopic imagery that made several delegates leave the chamber early. The cellular structure of Devourer organisms shows evidence of systematic degradation over evolutionary timescales. They are dying, slowly but inevitably, as their biological systems break down from lack of proper maintenance. She highlighted genetic sequences that told a story of gradual decay and desperate adaptation. Whatever species created the Devourers either abandoned them or was destroyed billions of years ago. The creatures we fought at Kepler were essentially biological machines running on degraded programming, consuming worlds because they had no other way to sustain themselves. But the most significant discovery, Kethvar said, resuming control of the briefing, came from Commander Chen's final transmission before her death. The Devourers weren't just fleeing random system failures. They were running from something that had been hunting them across the galaxy. The star maps shifted to show pursuit patterns spanning galactic distances, tracking the movement of Devourer fleets alongside something else. The pursuing entities left no direct traces, but their influence could be detected through the panic-driven behavior of fleeing Devourer ships. We call them the Architects, Dr. Rodriguez explained, based on fragmentary data recovered from Devourer memory systems. They appear to be the original creators of the Devourer organisms, and they have been systematically destroying their own creations for reasons we don't understand. Admiral Corvex leaned forward, his telepathic emanations carrying urgency that made the entire chamber uncomfortable. Current threat assessment? Unknown, Kethvar replied. But human tactical analysis of the Kepler engagements suggests we may have attracted their attention through our success against Devourer forces. The implications hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. By developing effective countermeasures against Devourers, organic civilization had potentially drawn the notice of entities that had been hunting those creatures for billions of years. Recommendations? Came a question from the Corvan military representative. Immediate implementation of human tactical doctrine across all Galactic Defense Council forces, Kethvar said. The boarding techniques developed by human forces represent our only proven method for defeating Devourer technology. But more importantly, they demonstrated capabilities that may be applicable against other forms of hostile intelligence. Dr. Rodriguez pulled up biological compatibility charts that had been refined over months of analysis. The most significant discovery is that human tactical psychology appears uniquely effective against artificial intelligences and biological constructs. The chaotic, unpredictable nature of human decision-making creates systemic failures in entities designed to process logical, predictable responses. In simpler terms, Kethvar added, humans are so irrational that they cause artificial minds to malfunction through sheer cognitive dissonance. The briefing continued for another 3 hours, covering technical details of devourer biology, tactical implications of architect pursuit patterns, and strategic recommendations for galactic defense preparations. But the core message remained constant. Humanity had revealed weaknesses in entities that had previously seemed invincible, but at a cost that few species could afford to pay. As the formal session concluded, Kethvar found himself approached by Admiral Corvex, whose telepathic emanations carried complex mixtures of gratitude and concern. "Commander," Corvex said, "the Council has approved your recommendations for implementing human tactical doctrine, but there are concerns about the psychological cost of such methods." "Understandable concerns," Kethvar replied. "Human tactics require personnel willing to accept certain death as an acceptable cost for uncertain tactical advantages. Most species lack the cultural framework necessary for such extreme sacrifice. Indeed, which raises the question, are humans willing to continue bearing this burden on behalf of galactic civilization?" The question had haunted Kethvar for months. Humanity had proven uniquely effective against threats that conventional military forces couldn't handle, but their methods required complete sacrifice of participating personnel. From a strategic perspective, humans had become the galaxy's most valuable military asset, precisely because they were willing to die in ways other species couldn't contemplate. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "The humans who fought at Kepler volunteered for suicide missions because they believed their deaths would save millions of lives. But asking an entire species to serve as galactic kamikaze forces raises ethical questions that transcend military necessity." After the briefing, Kethvar returned to the memorial wall, studying the names of humans who had died teaching the galaxy how to fight enemies that seemed impossible to defeat. Each name represented someone who had chosen to board hostile vessels, knowing they would never return. Someone who had transformed certain death into tactical advantage through sheer force of will. He was interrupted by a familiar voice. Quite a monument to human stupidity. Kethvar turned to find Dr. James Harrison, one of the few human survivors of the Kepler engagements. Harrison had been aboard a support vessel during the Second Battle, serving as a technical advisor rather than a combat participant. His survival had been accidental rather than planned. "Dr. Harrison," Kethvar acknowledged. "I didn't expect to see you at the memorial dedication." Harrison approached the wall, his expression unreadable. 18,000 names. 18,000 people who died because we were too stubborn to retreat when any sane species would have run. Their deaths saved millions of lives and revealed intelligence that may prevent future catastrophes. Their deaths, Harrison said quietly, revealed that humans are better at dying than any other species in the galaxy. And now everyone wants us to keep doing it. The conversation that followed touched on questions that went beyond military strategy. Harrison spoke about the psychological cost of survivor guilt, about the burden of representing a species that had become synonymous with tactical suicide. He described the pressure human military personnel now faced, knowing that galactic civilization expected them to solve impossible problems through extreme sacrifice. "The thing is," Harrison said, "we didn't board those ships because we're naturally suicidal. We did it because the alternative was watching 3 million civilians die while we stood by with ships and weapons that might make a difference. But now the galaxy sees human sacrifice as a renewable resource." Kethvar considered the implications of Harrison's words. In the months since Kepler, human military personnel had indeed been deployed to increasingly dangerous assignments. Their unique effectiveness against artificial intelligences and biological constructs making them invaluable for missions other species couldn't handle. The Council has authorized the formation of human tactical units for deployment against future devourer incursions, he said carefully. Volunteers only, with full disclosure of casualty expectations. Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Volunteers. As if any human could refuse when presented with a choice between certain death and watching aliens die because we were too selfish to help. Before Kethvar could respond, emergency alerts began broadcasting throughout the Council complex. Long-range sensors had detected massive hyperspace disturbances on the galactic rim, signatures consistent with entities far larger than any previously recorded devourer vessel. All senior commanders to emergency briefing, came Admiral Korvex's voice over the communication system. Priority Alpha Alert. This is not a drill. The emergency briefing revealed humanity's worst fears made manifest. The entities approaching from intergalactic space dwarfed Devourer ships the way Devourer ships dwarfed conventional vessels. Their energy signatures were unlike anything in galactic databases, but their trajectory was unmistakably directed towards systems where Devourer fleets had been destroyed. Preliminary analysis suggests these are the architects, Dr. Rodriguez reported, her voice steady despite the implications. They appear to be responding to the destruction of their Devourer constructs. Admiral Korvex's telepathic emanations carried waves of barely controlled fear. Time to system penetration? Approximately 6 months at current velocity, came the tactical assessment. First contact will occur in the Vega system, site of the original Devourer defeat. The briefing continued with discussions of evacuation procedures, fleet deployments, and diplomatic options for communicating with entities that had been systematically destroying their own creations for billions of years. But Kethvar found himself thinking about Harrison's words, about the burden humanity had accepted on behalf of galactic civilization. "Admiral," he said during a brief recess, "I request permission to address the assembled commanders." Granted. Kethvar rose from his position, drawing attention from military representatives of 47 different species. "Honored colleagues, we face an enemy that makes Devourers seem insignificant by comparison. Conventional military response will likely prove inadequate against entities that created biological starships as tools." He paused, meeting the compound eyes and optical senses of delegates who represented the galaxy's most advanced military forces. "But we have learned something important about fighting impossible enemies. Human tactical doctrine has proven effective against artificial intelligences precisely because human behavior patterns are too chaotic to predict or counter. Are you suggesting," Admiral Korvex asked, "that human boarding tactics will be effective against architect vessels?" "I'm suggesting that we may need to escalate human tactical doctrine beyond anything previously attempted," Kethvar replied. "The architects have been hunting Devourers for billions of years. They understand biological warfare, artificial intelligence, and technological development on cosmic scales. But they may never have encountered a species willing to transform entire star systems into weapons through tactical sacrifice." The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Bree. Harrison, who had remained in the briefing room despite his civilian status. "Commander Kethvar, are you proposing that humanity sacrifice entire worlds to fight these things?" "I'm proposing that we recognize what humanity has already taught us about fighting impossible enemies. Sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything in ways your opponent can't understand or predict." The debate that followed would reshape galactic military doctrine and establish precedents for species cooperation that transcended normal alliance structures. But the core question remained: how far was humanity willing to go to protect a galaxy that had come to depend on their unique willingness to die for others? 3 days after the emergency briefing, Kethvar received a personal message from Earth. The human government had made its decision regarding the architect threat, and their response would define humanity's relationship with galactic civilization for generations to come. The message was simple: volunteers accepted. No limits on tactical escalation. Send coordinates. As he transmitted the reply that would launch the largest military operation in galactic history, Kethvar found himself thinking about Chen's final words during the Battle of Kepler 442b. She had said that humans fought differently, that they transformed warfare into something beyond conventional military doctrine. But standing in the memorial hall, surrounded by 18,000 names of humans who had died teaching the galaxy how to fight impossible enemies, he realized she had been wrong about something crucial. Humans didn't fight differently because they were uniquely brave or tactically innovative. They fought differently because they understood something that no other species had fully grasped: that some battles were worth fighting even when victory meant the complete destruction of everyone involved. That survival was less important than ensuring that the universe remained a place where life could choose to stand against extinction regardless of the odds. The architects were coming, and humanity was preparing to meet them with tactics that would make the boarding actions at Kepler seem conservative by comparison. But for the first time since the crisis began, Kethvar felt something approaching optimism, because he had learnt what real fear meant. Not the terror of dying, but the horror of living in a universe where no one was willing to die for anything greater than themselves. And as long as humanity existed, as long as there were humans willing to charge impossible enemies with broken weapons and absolute determination, the galaxy would never have to face that particular darkness. The memorial wall behind him bore 18,000 names of people who had proven that organic life could stand against any enemy, could overcome any obstacle, could transform any defeat into victory, through sheer refusal to accept that some battles couldn't be won. Tomorrow would bring new impossibilities, new enemies that seemed invincible, new tactical challenges that defied conventional military science. But it would also bring humans willing to meet those challenges with the same stubborn determination that had already changed the course of galactic history. And for the first time in his long military career, Kethvar found himself believing that might actually be enough.